We've been talking a lot about Donald Trump's criticism of the intelligence community, but he's not the only one with harsh words. In his new book, Debriefing the President, The Interrogation of Saddam Hussein, former CIA senior analyst John Nixon describes what it was like to get inside the mind of one of the world's most famous war criminals. He was the first American to conduct a prolonged interrogation of the Iraqi dictator after his capture, and he joins me now from Washington. John, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
This is so fascinating. You wrote in your book that you, quote, lived and breathed Saddam, end quote, for years. What was he really like compared to the myths?
Saddam was a human being, and at the CIA we had a tendency to sort of see him as a man who was sort of pulling all the levers of government and being the master manipulator and the man who made all the decisions from top to bottom. And he was not like that at all. He was an elderly Iraqi grandfather, and he also was somebody who had sort of disengaged from governing his country and had really turned over the day-to-day role of governing to some of his senior assistants.
You also write in your book, interestingly, that you thought it was interesting, Saddam Hussein, when you interrogated him, believed that the United States was going to be on his side. Explain that.
Well, I think after 9/11, first of all, Saddam didn't have a very good understanding of international relations, and he didn't have a very good understanding of the United States. In fact, I would say, that he really had a very poor understanding. But having said that, after 9/11, he just assumed that the United States would see that there were no Iraqis involved, none of the hijackers came from his country, and that also the United States would see that the people who were involved, Al-Qaeda, were from countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and that we would automatically understand that these Sunni extremists threatened Saddam's regime as well as they threatened the United States, and that this would make us natural allies with each other. And he couldn't have been further from the truth or more wrong about that interpretation.
Ahead of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, there was much talk of weapons of mass destruction. What did Saddam Hussein tell you about WMDs?
He said he didn't have them. He said he wasn't working on building them, didn't have any programs, and had no plans in the future to develop a program.
And what were your thoughts at that point? You had gone into your assignment believing
Yes.
that these WMDs existed.
Well, it was very difficult to sort of figure out what he was saying, because Saddam was one of the most suspicious people I've ever met, and he was so secretive, and even when he was telling the truth, it made you think like he's hiding something or he's holding something back. And it wasn't until it was near the end of our debriefings that I really began to have second thoughts, and it wasn't really until I got back to headquarters where I said to myself, I started looking into some of the debriefings of other senior regime officials, particularly ones involved in past nuclear programs, and also in some of the captured documentation. And it wasn't until then that I really came to the conclusion that Saddam really was telling the truth. And I had talked about this with my colleagues, and we all came to the same conclusion.
Of course, at the time, the Bush administration had argued, even after it was discovered that there were no WMDs, that in fact it was the right thing to do to remove Saddam Hussein, to try and bring freedom to the people there in Iraq. But what is your argument now that you have looked back on this? You have come to a different conclusion about U.S. involvement in removing Saddam Hussein. What is it?
Absolutely. I don't see how anybody with a sane frame of mind can see anything good coming out of the removal of Saddam Hussein from power. 10 years later, after his death, we look at the Middle East now and the Gulf, and I ask the question, and I hate to ask a question with a question, but if there is something good, show it to me. I've looked for this, I haven't been able to find it. We now have a region where there is more extremism, and the extremism has spread. Israel is not, our ally, is not in a better position. They're probably in a worse position. Iranian power, the power that Iraq always balanced out, has spread throughout the region. And you also have the rise of ISIS, as well as before that Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
Saddam Hussein, though, what about the counter-argument to that, which, as you know, is that Saddam Hussein was a barbarous murderer responsible for the deaths of civilians, and that's
True.
Something in your book that you acknowledge.
True, yes. I don't approve of his methods at all. I think, and you know, it's really, I don't want to be put in the position of having to defend the indefensible. However, I will say this. After looking at what has happened after his execution and his removal from power, I have sort of developed a grudging respect for what it is he did. I mean, he kept his country together for decades. And despite the fact that he used some very, very barbaric methods, we have seen that Iraq is really not a very easy place to govern.
The president-elect, Donald Trump, has suggested a foreign policy of non-intervention in the Middle East, of not removing dictators. Do you think that's a wise policy?
I think that we have to find a better policy in terms of this all or nothing. You know, we're not going to do anything, or we're going to go in with 500,000 troops. We really, to be quite honest with you, we really have to use more diplomatic skill and also try to engage with some of the countries in the region that we traditionally have tried to ostracize. One of the things that I think we really learned from this fiasco in Iraq was not having an embassy in Baghdad turned out to be a very bad thing, because it not only isolated Saddam, but it also isolated us. And the sources of information that we had is one of the things that led to our misunderstanding Saddam and misassessing his rule.
Just to be clear, John, I want to make sure I'm straight on this, but based on your experience in Iraq, are you suggesting that U.S. interests are better served by leaving dictators in place?
U.S. interests, I think, are better served. I think we have to make a choice. Do we want stability and security? Sometimes the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. And I think that sometimes that's better than overthrowing a regime, then not doing anything to kind of set anything up that can take its place, and creating a vacuum in which chaos and instability reign.
Fascinating book, fascinating perspective. John Nixon, thanks so much for your time.
Well, thank you for having me.